Night is a talk show with published authors, writers, and content creators discussing both the creative and technical sides of writing, as well as the industry surrounding it, from novels to screenplays to comics and more. And now, here's your host, author Travis Sivart.
Welcome to Write Night. We'll get to the topic and discussion in just a moment. For those listening to the podcast, we record the podcast on our live stream at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and we have a live interactive chat audience. You might hear the sound of the bell ding, and that means I want to interrupt somebody to read a comment or question. For those on the live stream, we won't read off everything you put in chat, but we'll try to get to the most relevant, the most amusing, or some combination of the both. Now, while we introduce ourselves, go and let us know what you're reading, writing, or creating tonight. Okay, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. It is Write Night, and I am Travis Sivart, author of, well, I guess I specifically should focus on what we're editing tonight, because we're going to talk about editing, and we're going to do some live edits with just the two of us here. So, Silver and Smith and the Doppelganger's Gate, book 2 of the Silver and Smith Chronicles. And by the way, hello to Raven's Muse and Hot Diggity Dave. Good to see you guys. Let us know what you're reading, writing, or creating. And, yeah. So, something else I want to say before I pass the intro over to Tara is tonight I am actually drinking. Matter of fact, for this whole editing thing over the next few weeks, I'm going to be consistently drinking Writer's Tears, which I feel Tara should be drinking since she's the editor and I'm the writer. But, you know. Tara, care to introduce yourself and let them know how awesome you are?
Sure. I am the awesome Dreamer-in-Chief at Dreampunk Press, a small publishing collective based out of Norfolk, Virginia. Basically, we are a collective of authors who publish together. And I'm also an author, that publishes together with other authors in the collective. But I am also the top dog editor. God.
Well,
we could do retakes.
You need a verbal editor, don't you?
Editor for the publishing entity.
Very good.
I'm an editor of the written word, not the spoken word.
Yes.
Caveat there.
Okay. So, and that's excellent, Dave. That's pretty awesome. What are you learning jazz scales on? Are you just singing jazz scales, or do you have something to fadoodle-doodle on, Dave? Now, as for how things will work tonight, is we've pulled a chapter, and we're going to do 3 separate podcasts like this. A chapter from the first act of my book, a chapter from the second act, so right around the middle, and then a chapter from the third act of my latest book. And Tara has pre-edited, but we're going to go through, I'll read a page, then we stop, and she lets me know what she wanted to change and why. We will try to keep this in mind. There might be people listening on a podcast, but there are times things will just be visual, and forgive us if we actually skip over description for that. So, Tara, you're specifically doing a type of editing here. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we start?
Sure. So there are 3 types of phases of edit. There's a developmental edit, a copy edit, and then a format edit. And what I specialize in is the copy edit phase, which is when you go down through and you're looking almost line by line at how to make the copy better. You're not looking at plot. You're not really looking at characterization, character development, or any of that. You're really just focusing on the word and trying to make them as, better if you can.
Okay. Anything else to go say before we start this then?
No, let's get started.
Okay, let's get this started. Hold on, I got to voice practice. Yeah. Me, you, I, they. Quick question from Raven's Muse. So is line editing the same as copy editing?
Yes.
Very good.
Line editing and copy editing are basically the same thing.
Basically. What do you mean, basically? Is it not totally
They're
the same thing? Okay, they're the same
They're
thing.
the same thing.
Okay, just
They,
checking if there's a minutia
okay.
difference.
So copy editing is probably the term you would use for copywriting,
Such as
i.e.
newspapers?
advertising.
Okay.
Line editing is probably the better term for when you're working on a full manuscript.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to read a page, and just so you know, Tara, in case you're like, wait, stop, I'm going to read to the end of the paragraph, even if that paragraph hits the next page. Because
Don't do that for the first, not
No,
for the first page.
It works for the first page because it ends right
It
before.
does? Okay.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I looked.
Okay.
But yeah,
Okay.
that way I'm not cutting it off mid-sentence. So,
Okay.
a quick description, and we'll do this for each episode. Silver and Smith is set a few decades in the future from now, and I call it cyberpulp. So it is not quite cyberpunk, but not the pulp novels of the 1930s, but a blend of the two. So if Blade Runner and Indiana Jones had a baby, be something like this. So he stirred in the shadows. He didn't shift from nervousness or boredom. Instead, is whose nanotech-driven alterations cycling through a test sequence after not moving for a while. The ocular implant in his right eye flicked through the available spectrums, flashing infrared, the green of low light, then the spattered blue and yellow imagery of the magnetic field, stopping on the last setting. He zoomed in on the anomalies, things that crept underneath the walkway. The bounty hunter and archaeologists were oblivious to the things lurking below their feet as they moved away from the tall, thin man. The man's magnetic resonance was a mix of what came off the specimens and what came off Silver and Smith, no doubt due to the overlap of the fields of the two different species. The Watcher had seen these creatures in the reports given to him by his employer. He knew that the corporation had been experimenting with making prototypes of specialized biological machines, and he had to wonder if they were anything like the horrors that inched their way through the recesses of the city. His employer. He chuffed as he rolled the word across his thoughts. What was an unconscious reaction for most people, the quick outtake of breath at a thought that was bitterly humorous, was a conscious action for him. He crafted that reaction with care, perhaps to blend in, or maybe to just hold on to some of his waning humanity. And I'm going to stop there, and I wasn't sure if I should read it with the edits or without the edits, and we should have discussed that first, but now we'll know.
I think you read them with the edits, correct?
I went back and forth, really. Sometimes it's just better with the edits, and it felt right. Other times, yeah. So, and then sometimes with the colors on the screen, it's hard to tell what was the edit, what wasn't.
Right, yeah.
Oh, you know what? 1 second, quick screen change. My apologies to the viewing audience. There we go. Now everybody gets to see what we're working with.
All right, so let's talk about the edits.
Yep.
Let's talk about that first paragraph, because actually there is something in that first paragraph that usually an editor would change, which is the repeat of the he's in those first two sentences. He stirred in the shadows. He didn't shift from nervousness or boredom, yada, yada. And I left those alone because you haven't named this person yet. And it helps to emphasize we don't know who he is yet. It emphasizes that Silver and Smith do not know this person. He's watching them, and they're not really aware of it. So it helps to emphasize the fact that we don't know a name yet. For the reader, you know, in the previous chapter, we were with Silver and Smith, and now we've backed off.
Right.
Okay. And we're kind of noticing this gentleman, and we're getting closer. And this helps to keep that distance to this character as we get closer.
Well, let me ask you, would it be better if I changed it to stirring in the shadows, he didn't shift from nervousness or boredom, or switch it to he stirred in the shadows, not shifting from nervousness or boredom, blah, blah, blah. Leave it as he, period, he.
I think you should leave it he and he.
Okay.
Simply because when you're emphasizing that this is a male, and you are emphasizing that the reader does not know the name yet.
Raven also pointed out you also opted not to combine the two sentences because it would have run long. And now
Very long.
that she says that, there was places in here where I went and looked at a paragraph. I'm like, that's all one sentence. Where can I break it? And this might have been exactly one of those places. So I might have broke it on purpose. Okay.
Yeah. I didn't find, I felt that the repetition, sometimes you want a repetition.
Right.
And I felt that stylistically, this is a place for that type of repetition. So just because the norm would be you want your sentence structure different, you don't want every sentence to start with he, what you will find is there are times when you may want to have that repetition. I think it works where it is the very beginning of the chapter. Later on in the chapter, we probably would have wanted to change that up. But
Gotcha.
we don't know who this person is, and it's helping to emphasize that.
Let's go ahead and jump to the third paragraph where your next changes are, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Well, the next one we're going to discuss.
Okay.
So, yeah, because there's little things. We're not hitting every little change. Some changes are pretty much not a whole lot to talk about.
Yeah, there's
So
times
we're
where
going to,
in the edit she's removed an extra space or changed a misspelled word. We don't need to discuss those. For example, cycling through, I had left the R out of through. We're not going to talk about every single thing like
we're
that.
not going
That's
to talk
silly.
about that.
Okay, go on with
Okay.
this. Yes.
So, and they can see. Are they able to see?
The people
The
in
edit.
the live chat can see it right on
Right.
the screen. For anybody watching the podcast, that's where we try to give
Right.
a little bit more
Okay.
description for them.
Okay. So in the third and fourth chapter, so the third chapter starts
Paragraph.
the bounty hunter and archaeologist, meaning the bounty hunter, which is Silver, and the archaeologist, which is Smith.
Right.
The reason I want to talk about that is we already know it's Silver and Smith as the reader, but here we are, you're emphasizing their occupations. Because when we get to the next sentence and it starts off, the watcher, and of course, this is the he that we don't know the name of yet. And I just want to, I like this. Okay. A lot of times you have to identify, we know who they are. We don't need to, we already know they're, well, this is an emphasis because we are contrasting the bounty hunter, the archaeologist, and the watcher. Because again, this is a no-name watcher, but you're telling something about this person who is watching,
Right.
and you're contrasting him with Silver and Smith. And I like this. And again, a lot of times it's, once you have the characters, you don't identify them in this way. I mean, we're in chapter 7.
See, that's also from the watcher's point of view. It's his way of breaking down the people. The name means nothing. What they do for a living means something. It tells something. And there was a question in chat. Raven would like to know, do you offer line editing services? Are you accepting new clients at the moment?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay. So if you want to give a link, you can. If you don't want to give a link, we can leave it shush. But Raven, if you keep at me, Tara has been my editor for many years now and edited most of my books. If not, I think I can kind of safely say all except maybe one or two. So if you just keep bugging me, then as soon as she has an opening, and Raven, if I'm not mistaken, remind me or correct me if I'm wrong, you ghostwrite for a living, and now you're also writing your own stuff. Is that correct? I believe I have that right, because we have 3 or 4 different ghostwriters who hang out in the channel, and they make a living off their writing with somebody else's name. And that means they have the ability, and I pointed this out, they might well be more successful than somebody like myself, who, yes, I write under my own name, but I'm not making a living from it. So, there's a checks and balances. Okay, so
I'm making a living from editing, but not editing fiction.
yes,
Not
editing
yet.
for a living. Okay, so that's our 3rd paragraph. Are we ready to move to the 4th paragraph? You've got something else highlighted there in purple?
Yes. I added the ellipses there to set off creatures. I can't remember. I'm looking at it. I don't remember whether you just had it regular in there or if you had it broken up some other way. But that helps to emphasize these creatures, because he's not just watching Silver and Smith, which we understand that because of the bounty hunter and the archaeologist, which no spoilers, never mind. So again, okay, because again, that way of him thinking about it, but then he's also, he's seeing these other things that are there, and I just felt that this would help emphasize and show he's thinking. You've got him with gadgets and stuff embedded, right, and modifications, but he's still, rather, to help emphasize that even with all of that in that description of him, he's not a robot.
Right.
Okay, so I think it helped that he's he's noticing these things, and he's kind of wondering a little bit when we get in with that paragraph a little bit more. And I think it just helps to emphasize that he's thinking and help to give that characterization, especially since there's been so much so far of this being modified, and right, a lot of mechanical and electrical and modifications done, that yes, this is still a person. It's not a robot. They're not, that's not what we're looking at. They're still a thinking person. So
yeah, and the last paragraph really leans into that, where he doesn't have to do these things. They're not normal. He crafts them now with the And by the way, I see some word repetition in here, and I was curious about that, where rolled the words across his thoughts. What was an unconscious reaction for most people, the quick outtake of breath at a thought that was bitterly humorous, was a conscious action for him. He crafted that reaction with care. So what I'm seeing is we have reaction and action, which is similar but different, but then we also have thoughts, thought, and was there a 3rd time for that? So this might be something I want to clean up a little bit and fix up, because the word repetition, when writing you don't notice it, when speaking you don't notice it, but when you're reading it, man, that jumps out.
It didn't, the repetition in that paragraph didn't jump out at me. And when I tried putting other words in there, they didn't work as well.
Okay.
But you may want to look, because this character better than I do.
Right.
Now, by the time I finished the end of the manuscript, I knew this character even better. But be careful, because sometimes a repetition for a character can help, because he is very, and I'm trying not to drop spoilers too much about this.
Keep in mind, we are also visiting him again in other places later in the book. Even in our 3-chapter edit, I believe he's in one of the other chapters that we're going to edit over this 3 points. And by the way, I
Yeah,
want to
he
point
is.
this out. We're almost halfway through our normal 45-minute time, and we're still on page 1. This is why, yeah.
Um, so
Go ahead.
but sometimes the repetition is okay depending on the character. Because
Okay.
sometimes he's a little set in his ways. He has some assumptions that he's made, and that can help kind of reinforce that to the reader. I do want to talk. I changed the as he to and.
Right.
As stops the action
Right.
a lot of times. And this is just one place that I do. I'm going to talk about it later in depth where it has a little bit more impact, but I just wanted to pull out
No, I see it here.
as is something, and we put it in our writing a lot, and just look for that as, if you can pull those out, your writing, especially in an action scene, will happen much quicker. It won't slow down the pacing if you can take those out.
Gotcha.
And it's either use and instead or a comma.
Gotcha. Okay, you ready for me to read page 2? Or do you want to start
Ready for you?
talking about it before I read it?
I love his name.
Oh, thank you.
So how about you go ahead and read, because that's
Okay.
my first comment is going to be about his
I'm going
name.
to read page 2. Byron Savage had once been an agent for his current employer, a term that was interchangeable with the word equipment in the corporate handbook. Potential employees were candidates, and depending on what tasks they were brought on to do, there were a variety of other terms to define their roles, but employee was never used. An agent was a polite way of saying someone who was programmed to do what was needed to be done, from something as mundane as filing documents to something as specialized as assassination with prejudice. Savage had relinquished his position after fighting with the system and his superiors for almost 2 years. That was poorly read. Work with me on that. But only by the consent of the corporation. When they did agree to release him from his contract, which was very similar to indentured servitude in payment for modifications, he thought that he'd won that battle. He was no longer sure. They'd only approved letting him out of the agreement after he signed a different one in place of the first. Now, he was freelance. I'm sorry, reading what I think instead of what I saw. He was now freelance, a bounty hunter, an assassin, a finder of lost things. But the new contract stated that the company's business came before any business from anyone else, plus the usual NDA. It had seemed like a better deal at the time. Under the new terms, he didn't have the corporation's protection, and they had deniability when it came to anything he did. He did get paid per job, and that was nice, but he also had to pay for maintenance of his alteration, and there was a lot of them. I turn page 2 over to you.
All right. I want to talk about this name, Byron Savage. And I think, and this is in contrast because that first page we only got he, and here we get his name. This is when, because we've kind of, and with this is how he sees himself and how the talent agency sees him, which is, basically as a piece of equipment. And yet he, even with all of these modifications, he sees himself as something very different. And I think this is a beautifully done paragraph, especially with that name. Byron being, it's very old-fashioned in a lot of ways, very poetic if you think Lord Byron, etc. But then also think about, what was written. And then Savage as a last name.
Also literary.
And which, yes,
Doc Savage.
but it also harkens to how he does things later on. And I just think it's when I first read this name, I'm like, oh, okay. But then I'm like, as we get to know this particular character, it's a very fitting name, and I think you did very, very well at picking a name out for this guy.
Thank you. The name actually came to me first with the most smallest concept of the character, and the rest of the character grew around the name. It was a nice,
Right.
synthesis there. Is that the right word? Whatever. Have a question for you, though. Raven would like to know, do you ever use italics to emphasize a word instead of quotation marks or ellipses?
And actually, that's why I have those highlighted, because I had added the quotation marks. Because, sometimes, people will say agent, and I'm air quoting, and they air quote. But italics would work here just as well, I think, because this is this character, Byron Savage, thinking this to himself, which when contrast from the first page where he identified Silver as a bounty hunter, where he identified in his head Smith as an archaeologist, for him here, I'm not really, I'm an agent. That's what they call me.
Right.
So there's kind of a little bit of, existential crisis for this guy right here. And it kind of hints that he really doesn't know his purpose. He's finding it. He knows what he wants his purpose to be. And we discover this as we go. And I think this is a beautiful foreshadowing of that. I used the quotes here, but italics would work just as well. Ellipses would not work here. All right, because this isn't a thinking thing. He knows how the corporation thinks about him. And he knows he's not really, an employee and that employee. So ellipses wouldn't work here. He's not stumbling for the name. It's more of a agent. It's just their title for something, and then he describes it.
Very good. Now, for me, and not always, not saying this is correct. And hello, Wordwin. Good to see you. Usually when I use italics when writing a novel, now this doesn't count for online typing in a chat box where I use italics very differently. Italics, I will use it when somebody's thinking something. So instead of quotes or whatever, when they're thinking. Other than that, in a sentence, I will sometimes, in dialogue, use italics to stress a word. In narration, I wouldn't have thought to do that. I wouldn't have thought, because to me it says thinking the word or a dialogue stressor. But what you're saying is it's fine either way. There's no rule against it being done either time.
Correct. As long as you are consistent in whichever manner you choose to do.
Okay.
And again, as long as it's understood going to be understood by the reader. If you're going in here like, I'm going to use a different font, the reader won't understand what that is.
Now, something else I'm going to ask. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. You used regular dialogue quotes around agent and employee here. Because they're used for dialogue, I have wondered myself if I should be using the single quotations instead of double quotations.
Yeah, single quotations is what I probably should have put there.
Okay.
Instead of the double.
I'm glad I asked, because I would have definitely left it like that and trusted you.
Yeah, and I'm glad, because that was probably just a, mistype of the...
Well, I also understand you edit after a full day of work, so you're human. And that's something else to say about anybody with an editor. Editors never catch 100%. They really don't. They're human, and it happens. It's fair enough. Wordwin says, unless it's British, then double. So let's go down to... And what I'm going to try to do, since I want to try to move this along a little bit, the next 2 pages look pretty tight. I'm going to go ahead and read 2 pages instead of 1, and then let you comment on 2 pages in a row here.
Can I do a quick comment on...
Please.
Because I changed corporate protection.
Go ahead.
To corporation protection. I thought, and this is me interjecting on you, Travis. So if you do not agree with this, and this is where I would expect you to maybe ask me why I made the change.
Or make an artistic decision, either way.
Right. Or ask me first, though, why did you make that? Why did you make that? Because I want to tell you why. And this is why when you are writing, when you get red lines back from your editor, if you don't understand why they are suggesting you change something, ask them. Ask them. Because either they didn't understand what you were going for,
Right.
or you don't like, and then they can tell you, and then you can either, oh, well, that's not what I was going for, or you can go, oh, and you, because you're a team, remember, you're always a team with your editor. So corporate protection, but the corporation's protection is something the corporation gives, and he doesn't have it.
Right.
And I just thought that helped to emphasize that they consider the folks that work for them expendable.
You know, I might also...
And that when you contract out, you're even more expendable.
I might even change that to talent agencies protection. But then again, I kind of like the word corporation because it makes it more faceless and less named and specific.
Right.
Like
because
he's
this
distancing
book
himself
actually
from
has
Mm-hmm.
two corporations that are kind of at odds, and that allows the reader not just to get that feeling specifically about the talent agency, but that what you're actually trying to say a little bit about corporations.
And actually, I don't think
America.
I've specifically...
I said corporate America, but the way corporations as a whole act in this world.
And I don't think I've mentioned talent agency specifically, and that's probably why I left it like that, because I want the reader to go, which one is he working for, or is it a third one? Until I give that reveal later.
I think I recognize that it's talent agency from further on in the book.
Possibly. Well, I do mention...
I haven't mentioned that yet.
I do mention agent, which leans towards that, and agency is capitalized in the very next paragraph, so I'm leading into it, but he's leaning away from it as we go into it. Okay, so I'll read a couple pages at this point in time, and then we'll pop back, and there's a lot of corrections on this first paragraph, and everything else looks pretty tight. Okay, let me just go ahead and read this. He could replace or repair his armor and graphene skin suit through street contacts, but the agency always offered a higher quality of work and supplies, and better prices. The Magpulse weapon embedded in his forearm was available in other places, but the agency still dominated the market. The Zetabyte interface that stored information from, and fed information to, his implanted card phone environmental shifting graphene... I'm sorry, I'm not reading my commas. Environmental shifting graphene skin suit needed updates. Okay, when I do the audiobook, I'm going to have to read that sentence 2-3 times to get it right. The alloy bones in his legs and shoulders, the eye implant, and his other modifications needed maintenance, upkeep, and upgrades. Those things came from very specialized sources. That meant paying the very same company that invented them to do the work. That wasn't cheap. Movement drew his attention back to the things hidden in the shadows. They weren't the crawlers that scavenged for trash, though they had a similar magnetic signature. They were biological, not technological. Savage had never seen a biosign that read magnetic before now. His internal AI searched for any reference to such things in the background as he watched his targets being stalked. The creatures were something from nightmares that had been buried in myths, legends, and conspiracies for centuries. They moved on 2 or 4 legs, like a bear. That was where the similarity between them and anything natural to the planet ended. Savage's AI brought up all relevant information, most of which were the reports he'd already read. The monsters were often amphibious, and it was unusual for them to be found in a city or an urban area. Most references alluded to folklore from out-of-the-way villages being attacked, or of cultists trying to summon things from some other plane of existence. The creature's eyes were myriad, though not like an insect's compound build, but rather dozens of individual cavities that varied in size, blinking and focusing on multiple things at the same time. It was a primitive species, with natural weapons like claws and teeth. And they were on the hunt. Should that be a new paragraph? And they were on the hunt? Nah, it's probably fine on its own. Savage watched them follow Silver and Smith from below the steel grates of the raised walkway. That needs clarified, I think. Where he watched them follow Silver and Smith. Is he below the grates, or are they? But I'll go back to that. The billionaire damn it.
Billionaire philanthropist.
Philanthropist. I couldn't get the second syllable. I lost the second syllable. And Bounty Hunter showed an odd magnetic resonance also. Like he was just off from what most people showed. See, this is right here, odd magnetic resonance also. Up here, I said no other biological life forms had shown magnetic resonance. And later, I say all creatures have magnetic. So that's something I'm going to have to, instead of read this sort of magnetic before, or something like that, I'll have to clarify that. The technology of Savage's ocular implant was a new tech, and ironically, based on an offshoot of the research pioneered by Silver. Most things had a magnetic field, from the Earth itself to living creatures. Recent advances in science had allowed the agency to detect those emanations. Fun fact, psychics, witches, and charlatans had been reading these waves from people, calling them auras, since the dawn of mankind. It was the natural electromagnetic wave field generated by every living being and many non-animate objects. MRIs also used a primitive sort of detection system to check soft tissue for anomalies. This was just the next logical step in that series of discoveries. Or to be more specific, 3 steps beyond MRIs. Zooming in, Savage's zettabyte processor, the latest processing and storage measurement that had followed exabytes, petabytes, and terabytes, and led the way into yottabyte devices, took the information, stored and compared it to references dating back to ancient Greece and beyond. I'm going to pause here to let you talk about what you want to talk about before I get into the next. That is, to me, a very interesting info dump.
Okay. So a couple things that you brought up, and I think you're right, and they were on the hunt would work much better as its own paragraph, to set that off. Here's where my ET background, electronics technician background, is going to kick in a bit, because a magnetic resonance and then things having a magnetic field, because we all know, I do know that everybody has a magnetic field. That is different than a magnetic resonance. So you're good there. You're okay. Okay, a magnetic field is not a magnetic resonance. Okay, a resonance is when you have more than one and they're syncing.
Okay, so my science is wrong here, or it's okay?
No, you're right, you're okay.
Oh, good.
And I did not find it odd, because when I'm reading it, he's looking at these creatures that have this obvious magnetic resonance. And then because he's seen this, and he goes to look at Silver, and he goes, wait a minute. And to me, it's pretty obvious there. He's like, wait a minute. Silver has one, and it's a little, not to the degree of those other creatures, is how I took that. So I don't think him suddenly taking a look back at Silver and going, wait a minute, his is a little bit off.
Right.
He has a little bit of one, I think, is okay. And again, when you start talking about everything having a magnetic field, maybe if you can interject, magnetic field and magnetic resonance is a little bit, everything has a magnetic field.
That would allow me to, okay.
And then the non-ET folks won't get confused.
Good. Well, I'd like my science to be good. And by the way, Raven says, and thank you for the kind words, Raven, so many indie authors constantly slip into passive voice or write too many sentences the exact same length. It hurts my brain to listen or read. You don't have that newbie bad habits, and I adore you for it, Raven. Thank you. The sentence thing has never been a problem, but you can ask Tara, passive voice was something I did a lot in my earlier writing, like consistently, and I worked hard. I take it as a personal challenge every time Tara hands me a book back. If I see consistent issues through the whole book, that's a bad habit I need to learn. And there's been times I've come to her going, why? How do you do this right? And then I will question her, and I will go to other editors here on Twitch and other places and go, what do you think? And they'll disagree with her, and I'll bring that back to her. And then separately from all of them, I'll go do my own research and make up my own damn mind. You know, we did this with ellipses and the spaces after em dashes and all this, and yeah. So, thank you, Raven. Appreciate the kind words. Tara, do you have some more to say on these 2 pages?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you're writing a whole lot more like me all the time.
It's better in some ways, worse in others. We have
but I do want to reiterate that, yeah, you have been paying attention to the edits that I've been giving you.
And I'll encourage that in any writer.
The first things that I edited for you, we addressed some of those. The repetition of sentence length, a lot of that makes it hard to read. And like you said, you asked questions and paid attention. And so there's not a whole lot that I find anymore in your right. There will be instances where there'll be a page and it's like, oh, and I know why. You know, You got into it and you're writing some big action, whatever, and we get off a little bit. And then we work on it. But yeah, you have written a lot of stuff. And that's how you get to be a better writer, just by, even if you don't ever publish and you never give it to another somebody to edit. If you write and write and write, and you read what you write 6 months or 8 months later, as a reader, then you'll start seeing what you're doing that can improve, especially if you're also reading other people.
And here's what I'll tell any writer out there. Read what your editor sends back. I don't care if it's just correcting little things or correcting huge things. Read it. Learn from it. Because this is how you grow. And take it as a personal challenge. Tara, you'll notice there's a lot less as he did, as she did.
Yes.
Because that's something, once I realize that's something you're pulling out, that's a bad habit. Let me look at that. It is unnecessary words. And anybody who watches me write or edit my own work will often hear me yell at myself, there it is again, Travis, don't put that there. Because we already know they're doing it as they do it, so you don't need to say as they do it. But yeah, learn from me. I know some people who would take all the edits and just accept them all and roll on. Don't do that. For 2 reasons. First of all, you can't learn that way. You can't write better. Second of all, your editor could be wrong. Or there are places Tara will put down an artistic choice, and I make a decision. And I go,
exactly.
And there's other times where I'm like, oh, Tara missed that. It happens. So rereading the whole work when you're doing the cleanup, it's important. For many reasons. Okay, anything else on these 2 pages you'd like to discuss before we go on?
No.
Okay.
I had the 2 things, but let's move on.
Well, I'm good with time. This is why we discussed that before we started. But if you're okay, I'll just go on. I'll read another 2 pages, or at least till the end of this information point, which hopefully it comes out well. Let's find out. Let me read it and see what we think. There it is. Since the lost scrolls of Alexandria had been recreated using MRIs and other imaging technology. Also, let me interrupt myself before I go on. Guys, I am reading this fresh. I haven't practiced it. I haven't read over it ahead of time, besides the one time I wrote it, the second time I cleaned it up. This is the 3rd time to 5th time I've ever read it. So I don't have the pacing down for the storytelling. Work with me on that one. Since the lost scrolls of Alexandria had been recreated using MRIs and other imaging technology, many lost myths had been recovered. The Athenian Egyptian resource had been lost on multiple occasions, on purpose or through misfortune, but the agency had invested a lot of time and money recovering any information that could be reconstructed. They said it was for altruistic reasons. But Savage knew the motives of the agency were far from the reasons that would help the world. References to Atlantis, ancient Maya, ancient Egypt, even Babylon and Sumer popped into the feed from his implant. This fed into the theorem of convergent conceptualization or recombinant conceptualizations, where the same idea came to light and was studied in different places in civilization. Similar cultures, a world apart, coming to the same conclusion or next step in scientific discovery at the same approximate time in history was a much debated concept, but it seemed to have happened many times throughout mankind's short timeline. Did I use many a lot in that paragraph, or is it just... maybe it's just me. Glancing and sifting through the information on his readout, Savage took the vague but most pertinent information and digested it. A possible alien presence, long on this planet, that interfered in human development and could potentially shapeshift stood out in the info dump. The offshoots mentioned genetically altered beasts that led to many myths throughout time. Byron wasn't worried about the history. He only needed to figure out if these things meant to help or harm his targets. If it was the latter, the simple solution was to take them out. If it was the former, then far darker possibilities lurked at the edges of his mind. Savage stood, his tech humming in his head, a constant background noise that he lived with, and dropped 3 stories down into the alley. His knees bent as he landed with a soft thump, a block behind his quarry. And I'll stop here, I think, because we're about to get into combat. And yeah, let's go ahead and give you a chance to talk about that before we move past all that.
So first, for a data dump, that moved very well.
Was it interesting?
It was very interesting, especially for somebody who likes ancient Mayans, ancient Egypt. You know, I watch documentaries all the time.
Wait, real ones or the ones that are now on Discovery Channel and are so sad?
No, the real ones. Yeah,
Aliens.
Yeah, ancient aliens. Although I'm wondering if I should watch some of that as research.
They're entertaining. And what I'll tell you about those, without going too far on a tangent, is they take a few good, solid facts and then segue way the hell away from them, which most people go, we've attached the two. And anybody who's thinking goes, wait a minute, I saw what you did behind the curtain.
Yeah. For anyone wanting to take some little bit of truth, pull a Dan Brown, for instance, or a Travis Sivart, which is what you're doing here. Watch Ancient Aliens and take notes, because they pick these 2 little things. And then all of a sudden, and they traipse you around, and then look, this is what this means, but it's very
you're caught
smooth,
up, and you just go to it,
and you're caught up with it. And for entertainment, and if you recognize what it is as entertainment, it's pretty good. But if you're reading, if you're watching rather because you want to actually learn, something about, no. But again, there was a lot there, but I think because you were pulling those different things, even, and because Savage is pulling things in from his feed. So he's reviewing this and he's giving the reader a summary of what's coming in his feed, because he's done this pull of information. It works even as a data dump, because Savage, it's not for the reader only. It is also for this character. This is, Savage is getting, this is the information, and this is how he's kind of compiling it in his mind. And that's the kind of thing, if you have to give a lot of data, a lot of background to your reader in order to orient them into what's going on, this is one really, really good way to do it.
This is one of those breadcrumbs that I was asking about before we started broadcasting. You know, how the mystery is laid out, how the mystery trail is laid. Okay, what else you got for these couple pages before I go on?
And then I just wanted to, point out sometimes verb tenses, and sometimes when you get with just to watch them, because that's what came and was studied in. If you wanted it would be come to light and study.
Right.
But again, that's kind of weird because it could be stated either way.
Right.
And that's why I kind of highlighted that one, is because it could be stated, come to light and study in, or came to light and was studied in.
That's something else I noted consistently in earlier writings of mine, where I would mix tenses and you would correct it, and I've tried to pay closer attention to it, so hopefully that was easier and cleaner in this book.
Yes, and like I said, the reason I wanted to call out this one is because it could be stated, a lot of times it can only be stated one way.
Right.
But in this instance here, it could have been stated either way, and you just kind of flip the switch midway.
Right.
And I just wanted to pull that because sometimes that will catch you up, especially when it could be stated either way, because you're talking about a kind of an iffy instance kind of thing, but that's all I had to say here, so we can move on.
Okay, I'm going to try to do 2 pages here. He just landed a block behind his quarry. His contract required the tech and information that the 2 people would acquire in their job, and Savage would do what was needed to make sure they did the footwork for him to get what he needed. Pulling an electronic tag on the interface on his arm, Savage swiped the digital tracer at his targets, and the card phone interface of his implant lit up as the program linked to Silver's device. I've got the word interface too often there. It's twice. I'll have to adjust that. The things in the recesses turned and looked in Savage's dozens of eyes blinking at him. Did these things hear or feel the transfer? Byron thought. He pushed the idea away as the creatures turned towards him. Again, we have turned multiple times. I need to look at that. Fight or flight were his options. Lead them away or face them down. There were enough of them that they could split their forces and follow him and his targets. Fighting, then. Hunkering down, he made himself a smaller target, one that also allowed him to move in any direction. He looked at the flow of foot and vehicle traffic. Savage wanted the area clear of observers. He sent a notification of a traffic snag to local map apps. The notice would draw drones to see what was blocking the street, but that would take a few minutes. He wouldn't have long, but he didn't need much time. The crowd of pedestrians checked their card phones at the alert and began heading out of the area. Traffic turned down side streets, seeking a way around whatever unseen emergency was happening. Savage checked his stores of ammunition and power. The Magpulse web embedded in his right wrist showed 70% power. Part of those resources allocated and held in reserve for his legs and armor. The needle gun in his left forearm was full, and he mentally keyed it for debilitating poison that could take down a large animal. It wouldn't stop an elephant, but it would take down a moose. The internal targeting system identified 3 targets in range for the needles, but only 1 for the pulse gun. You want me to pause here before we enter combat so you can make comments? I saw your finger wiggling.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about interface and the repetition there. I was trying to think if I could. Yeah, you're gonna have to.
I'll clean it up.
Yeah.
So what I'm going to say is,
you also mentioned some repetition on turned.
right.
And yeah, that didn't jump out as me as a big problem at that point. Unless you want, them to when it gets to when the creatures
I could use the
turn
word
towards
spun
them,
instead of turn.
pivoted might work.
Yeah, pivoted.
Because that
that
will
kind of thing.
also, like, they didn't just turn, they spun around,
Right.
changed direction completely.
Right. And
That
considering
could,
we're coming up on an hour, I think I'm going to call it for this episode. And if anybody cares to join us for the next episode, we will be looking at chapter 13. So about close to the center of the book, middle of Act 2. And we'll pick it up there. We've got about halfway through this chapter at this point in time, but it gives us an idea of what we're looking at. And we'll see how the book changes, the writing changes, and the editing changes in our next episode. So
yeah, I think most of everything else that I had in here was just the static little,
you got it. Okay.
so,
Say goodbye to everybody,
bye.
and we'll catch you on the next episode. Let's get some outro music. Here we go. Before we go, I want to remind everyone that you can email us at rightnightshow@gmail.com. That's right with a W, night with an N, show@gmail.com. To let us know your thoughts on the show's topic, suggest other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or just have a message read out on air to someone in your life. Thanks to everyone for supporting the show by downloading the podcast, sharing it on social media, grabbing some shirt stickers and mugs from bit.ly/tavern merch, or barware patches and hats from bit.ly/tavern merch too. That's bit.ly/tavern merch or tavern merch followed by the number 2. Thanks to everyone who joined us live at twitch.tv/Travis Tavern Talk, and everyone who supports the tavern by subscribing, hosting, throwing bits, raids, and most of all, commenting.
Thank you for joining author Travis Sivart and the other writers, content creators, and all-around amazing people for our discussion here on the Right. Join us again soon, and until you do, make sure you create with passion, enjoy the journey, and remember, every night can be right night.